Um, we'll talk about the perspective that I think gets ignored to some degree in the crucifixion, the suffering uh, story, and I want us to look at it and maybe see some new things in the way we look at it. I want us to. I mean, first of all, we have to acknowledge that the Father, Son, as we refer to two parts of the Godhead as Father and Son, that we have to acknowledge that that's a metaphor, that there was no point where one part of the Godhead gave birth to another part of the Godhead. Jesus was never, as God, he was never, a little God and grew up into be a big God. So the Father and Son metaphor is for us to help us understand the depth of relationship and the value that uh, is between the persons in the Trinity. Um, as as parents, especially, but even as children who maybe don't have children of their own, but we can appreciate what it means when Jesus talks to the Father, and when we think of the Father and Son in the Trinity, we should get some appreciation, and I think we miss a little bit of that. But we should have some appreciation as to how deep is the love, how deep is the commitment, how deep is the value and the relationship between those the parts of the Godhead. So that brings me to Judges chapter 11 and the story of Jephthah, who, for convenience sake, I'll probably call Jeff most of the time, but while reading the scripture, I'll stick with Jephthah, which is a name that somehow hasn't really made it down through the ages. It was passed on, not like some other names. I wonder if in other cultures there's Jephthahs, but not so much in the States. All right, I'm reading in Judges 11 and verse 29. Now the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, so that he passed through Gilead and Manasseh, and then he passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he went on to the sons of Ammon. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, "If you will indeed give the sons of Ammon into my hand, then it shall be that whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the sons of Ammon, it shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering." And so Jephthah crossed over to the sons of Ammon to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. Down to verse 34, when Jephthah came to his house at Mizpah, behold, his daughter was coming out to meet him with tambourines and with dancing. Now she was his one and only child. Besides her, he had no son or daughter. And when he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you are among those who trouble me. For I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot take it back." And so she said to him, "My father, you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you have said, since the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the sons of Ammon." And she said to her father, "Let this thing be done for me. Let me alone 2 months, that I may go to the mountains and weep because of my virginity, I and my companions." And then he said, "Go." And so he sent her away for 2 months, and she left with her companions and went up the mountains, went up or wept up on the mountains because of her virginity. At the end of the 2 months, she returned to her father, who did to her according to the vow he had made, and she had no relations with a man. Thus it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went yearly to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah of Gilead, the Gileadite, 4 days in the year. So, first of all, just want to say that story is a terrible story. Just ridiculous, and yet the Holy Spirit saw fit to put it in on the record and put it in our Bibles for, I believe, a reason. And one reason I think is to that it illustrates, on the one hand, it illustrates the outrageous loyalty, uh, the obedient submission of this girl, and in this way, she's a symbol or a type of Christ, the obedient son. That she's not taken against her will. That she talks her father kind of into it. Granted, his vow is absurd at the least, but having made the vow, she says, you have to keep your word. That it has to be done. You have given your word to the Lord, and the Lord has avenged you of your enemies. So she values the victory because he had set up this victory sacrifice connection, that the victory would cost him a sacrifice. And he left that sacrifice as unnamed, but he had set that up, that the victory would cost him a sacrifice. And when that sacrifice was named, he was reluctant to give it up. But she, the call her child, but I don't want us to think of her as a youngster in that sense. She's young enough to be unmarried, but old enough to wish she was married and to go off for 2 months on her own. So she's not a child; she's a young woman. But it's her. She's the one who says to him, God gave you the victory and you gave your word. And so this has to be done. And so it's a symbol of the willingness of Christ, that he was a willing participant in the sacrifice. Sometimes you'll hear from critics of Christianity that the whole idea of a father giving up his son, punishing his son for someone else's sake, is kind of disgusting and deplorable, and they're right. I mean, that's the point of the story, I guess. I mean, to some degree, like the whole Abraham Isaac thing is like, yeah, that's horrendous, that's terrible, and yet that's what was required. And so that brings me to the next part, and this is the perspective that I think that we ignore, is the anguish of the father. I think that we often connect emotions to Jesus and disconnect the Father part of the Godhead from all emotion. And we think of the Father as just being justice, the representative of justice in the deity, and Jesus being the representative of love. But the whole point of the father-son metaphor is to help us to understand how great the love is between the father and son, and that as a parent, you could not possibly think that the giving up of your son or your daughter, your child, would be easy or unemotional. That as a parent, the suffering of a child is personal suffering for the parent. When a child, when the child has to get a needle and they're freaking out, parents, parents just struggle. They hurt, even though they know that it's just a momentary and an easy thing. Parents still hurt over that, and I suppose more than one parent has struggled to hold back tears in those moments, and have possibly turned away so that the child doesn't see the struggle that the parent has. And I wonder if when we sing the songs about the father turning his back on the son, when we think about that in the case of Jesus and the Father, I wonder if we've misinterpreted what was supposed to be being illustrated there. Is I think we might have misinterpreted it as the father coldly, disinterestedly turning his back when maybe like the mother who turns around so the child doesn't see her cry, so that they can be strong and not affected by their own emotions. I wonder if that's not closer to what we're supposed to hear when we think of the father turning his back. I think that the anguish that Jeff feels, that he's won a victory, and in the process is losing his one and only daughter. I'm saying that's an illustration of what the father went through and the anguish that he felt. That there was a necessity in what they did, and there was an absolute cooperation in what they did. But I think we've so long minimized the struggle on some level, and the emotional connection between the father and son, that I think is rock solid, foundational to the metaphor of father and son, that we're supposed to understand that that the father hurt as love amplifies suffering. The father's love for the son amplified the suffering that he felt when his son suffered, and that he didn't do that without reason. That as a parent, when we read Abraham and Isaac, and we read about Jeff and his daughter, we think how outrageous that is, and how, especially particularly in the case of Jeff, that the reason doesn't make sense to us, but just at least part of what's going on is this is a metaphor and an illustration that there was a connection between the victory over God's enemies and the setting free the people of God from oppression. There was a connection between those things and the sacrifice, that those were connected, that the one couldn't be achieved without the other. And as terrible as it comes across, it was that much more terrible for God the Father to give up the Son for the victory over his enemy and to set free his people from oppression. He did that. That Father did that to set us free. That you are the reason that a father allowed his son to suffer. You're the reason for what I can only imagine would be the broken heart of God as he had to watch what his son went through. I believe that's the whole purpose of the metaphor, and it drives home this point in Romans chapter 8 and verse 32. He who did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us all, how will he not also with him freely give us all things? This should be so clear to us, and it should be so clear to us that if God the Father would give up his son to suffer as he did for you, then his love for you is beyond measure. His value that he puts in you is infinite. It's unfathomable. Um, he loves us, and he loves you, and he wants you to know that, to experience it, to live in the joy of it, to work in the power of it, to endure whatever you have to go through, knowing that he loves you and that there is nothing that he would withhold from you that's for your good. And so I just want to encourage us that he loves us, and that the sacrifice of Jesus is a powerful illustration, not just of the willingness of Jesus, the obedience of Jesus, but of the value that the Father puts in us and the love that the Father has for us. He was willing to do what it took to get us victory and to set us free. So let's walk in that freedom, and let's live a life that brings him glory.